Hello everyone, this is Reach of the Sky, and this is my next video in my series of descriptive videos describing variants of, well, planes as well now. It's been tanks up until now. I've covered the Panzer III, Panzer IV and T-34. But for my fourth video I thought I'd switch over to planes for those of you out there that prefer the aircraft side of War Thunder. So, just in case you haven't watched this series before, I'm going to be covering the background, the design features of a particular vehicle. In this case the 109, the distinguishing features of each variant featured in the game. So there's 10 variants in the game at the moment, so it's going to be quite a long video. I won't be including variants that aren't in the game at the moment, so this is less about gameplay and more about technicalities, the history of the plane, the actual details of the variant itself. So if you're interested in that, then I'd advise you to keep watching, because this should be quite enjoyable. Or at least I hope so. So the 109 began on the drawing board in the early 1930s. The Reich Aviation Ministry began to look into the future of air combat in 1933, and obviously they knew straight away they needed a modern single-engine, single-seat fighter aircraft. They wanted a plane that was capable of 400 kilometers an hour at 6,000 meters, with good climb speed and a high ceiling. A number of designs were submitted to the ministry. Planes were sent by Arado, Focke-Wulf, Heinkel, and the Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, abbreviated to BF, which is where the name BF 109 comes from. The 109 was found to have superior top speed, climbing and diving characteristics, and for these reasons it won the contract. The main philosophy behind the 109 was to keep the design light, which allowed good acceleration, top speed, roll rate, climb rate. And the 109 had these qualities, which is why it won the contract. So the first variant here in game is the 109E1. Tier 2, battle rating 2.3. The 109E entered production in late 1938. It was the first variant to utilize the Daimler-Benz 601 engine. Now, compared to the earlier variants, A to D, this was a larger engine, so there was a design change required in the airframe. The radiators, which were initially on the fuselage, were moved underneath the wings. You see there's the left one and the right one. And the radiator placement counterbalanced the weight of the heavier engine, which was quite lucky for the designers. That's the radiator there. The oil cooler is this duct here, which is squared off. So the radiator managed to counterbalance the weight of the engine. So initially these ducts would have been further forward, so they moved further back, which prevented too much weight building up in the nose of the aircraft. But the problem with having radiators mounted underneath the wings was on a wet or muddy airfield. The undercarriage could throw up mud and debris and so on into these intakes and clog them. But it was a good design choice for the reasons I just specified. The E1 had a pair of MG17s in the engine cowling, one there, and one mounted in each wing, one there and another one there, for a total of 4. The MG17 was a rifle caliber light machine gun. It fired a 7.9mm cartridge. It was capable of 1,200 rounds per minute, and its muzzle velocity with armor-piercing shells was around 900 meters a second. But the MG17 lacked hitting power, which is what the pilots declared to the designers back in Germany. And this led to the cannon-armed variants. The first one in War Thunder here is the BF-109E3. This had an MGFF in each wing, which replaced the MG17s. These were drum-fed autocannons with 60 rounds per drum. They were capable of around 530 rounds a minute, and they fired at around 600 meters a second. Each drum carried 60 rounds, which is why the E3 has a total of 120 cannon shells, as you can see there at the bottom of the stat card. The projectile weight, including the casing and the explosive filling, was 134 grams, compared to the 35.5 grams of the MG17's projectile, so it's obvious that the shell packed a much higher punch. Next along is the BF109 F1, this small e in brackets distinguishes these as the early Fs compared to the F4, which is slightly later. So this is the F1, Tier 2, battle rating 2.7. By the way, these are 2.3 and 2.7. The F1 is also 2.7. This is the first of the Friedrich series, the F, the 109F. The 109F flew very well. It was an aircraft that incorporated a number of improvements over the E, or the Emil. It had improved aerodynamics, it had smoother, rounder engine cowling, which is this area on top of the fuselage at the front. The spinner, which is the nose cone here, blended very well into the cowling. The seam along here blended nicely. And it had a streamlined oil cooler radiator. So you can see here the radiator is much closer to the fuselage. It's flatter and wider. If we go back to the E, you can see that the cowling, the radiator intake, sticks out more, so it was flattened against the fuselage to reduce air resistance. Now the tail fin was given a sort of airfoil shape, which meant it bulged slightly in the centre, and it curves upwards and then downwards. This created a slight sideways force that pulled the tail slightly to the left. This counteracted the engine torque, which pulled the aircraft slightly to the right, so this centred the torque and prevented swaying, especially on takeoff. And the bracing struts you see here on the E, beneath the horizontal stabilizer. These aren't present on the Friedrich because the fuselage had been strengthened. It no longer had the need for these bracing struts, so that reduced weight and wind resistance. And the rounded off wingtips. So they're semi-elliptical. The rounded off wingtips reduced drag and slightly increased the wingspan. And the shallower wing radiators, much like the rounded off wingtips, improve the handling of the aircraft because there was less drag underneath the wings. There was a new DB601N engine, which developed 1159 horsepower. A single nose-mounted MGFF/M, and the M stood for Minengeschoss, which meant the shell had a thinner casing, which meant more explosive charge could be packed into the shell, compared to the MGFF on the E3, which had a weaker shell. The benefits of a nose-mounted cannon was that there was no effect of convergence. The pilot didn't have to converge his weapons. The shells always fired straight out of the nose, so there's no need to adjust convergence. So that's the F2. Next is the that's the F1. Next is the F2. Battle rating at 3.3, also Tier 2. The MGFFM in the nose was replaced with the 15mm MG151/15, which fired at approximately 710 rounds a minute. The MG151/15 led to the 20mm MG151/20, which was the best 20mm cannon the Germans mass-produced in the war. Now that's the only real difference between the F2 and the F1, the change of the armament. Next is the F4, battle rating 3.7, Tier 3, the first Tier 3 109. The F4 used a even newer engine, the DB601E, and this developed 1332 horsepower, which is 173 more than the engine the early F1 and F2 used. It was the first variant to utilise the new 20mm MG151, which fired at approximately 675 rounds a minute. It was found out that the pilots preferred a more powerful shell to a higher muzzle velocity, which is why the 15mm was replaced by the 20. The F4 was the first model to support underwing gondolas, as you can see here, which mounted a pair of MG151s. This massively increased the firepower and made it particularly effective in an anti-bomber role, but it did hinder the plane's dogfighting capability. Added drag and added weight on the wings. Next is the F4 Trop, which is short for tropical, which is essentially identical to the F4, except for a different camo, and some very minor changes, such as an air intake filter, which prevented sand and dust from entering the engine. There was protective covers available, packed away inside the aircraft that the pilot could bring out in case of sandstorms and so on. F4 Trop also had an emergency kit with food and water and a pistol for defending himself in case the pilot had to drop in the middle of nowhere. Next up is the G2 Trop, which is tier 3 also, and a battle rating of 4.3. The G2 was the first, is the first Gustav series 109 in War Thunder. It had reinforced wings, bulletproof windscreen, stronger, heavier cockpit frame, and an armoured fuel tank. These changes made the plane more durable, but they increased the weight. However, the Gustav used a more powerful engine, the DB605A, and that developed 1455 horsepower, which is 123 more than the F4 developed. But this maximum output was banned for a short period as it caused reliability issues, but eventually those were resolved and the maximum output could be used again. Next is the 109 G6. This is tier 4, the first tier 4 BF-109, and it has a battle rating of 5.0. The G5 onwards had a larger tail unit. Both the horizontal stabilizer and the vertical were increased in size. That improved the handling, but also increased the weight, especially since a counterweight was required inside the nose to balance the weight. The G6 had a pair of 13mm MG151s, which replaced the earlier rifle caliber MG17s. The large breech blocks required these canopy blisters here, which is why the G6 had the nickname of Die Boiler, which means the bulge or the blister, which reduced the speed by about 9 km an hour, but of course it increased the hitting power. The G6 could be fitted with Werfer Granate 21 rocket launchers, which were extremely powerful underwing rockets, which could obliterate even the largest of aircraft, and they were used primarily against bombers. The G6/U4 could mount the 30mm MK108, Machine Cannon 108, as you can see here, U4, which was a compact version of the MK103. They had a shorter range, but it made it easier for mounting in small aircraft like the 109. The MK108 was a very powerful cannon. It was capable of crippling a fighter with a single hit, and could cripple a heavy bomber with 4 or 5 hits, usually no more than 5 hits when needed. Next is the G10, battle rating of 5.7. This had the DB605D2 engine, which developed around 780 horsepower. It was a stopgap until the K series was ready in sufficient numbers. It was fitted with MW50 water injection, methanol water injection as standard, and that vastly increased the supercharger's safe boost level and could add up to 500 horsepower. The blisters were streamlined, as you can see here. They were flattened and lengthened. There's a slight bulge on the side of the cowling here, you can see on the left hand side, or the right hand side from this direction, because the DB65D2 had a very large supercharger, so the cowling had to be bulged out slightly. And there are these small blisters underneath the fuselage here, beneath the exhausts. You see one there, and the other there. This is because the crankcase was enlarged, and the oil return lines were also quite prominent, so these bulges were needed to cater for those. And the G10 also used the improved Air Haube canopy. You can see it's got much less framework, so the pilot's visibility was improved. And finally is the K4, the Kurfürst, battle rating 6.0. This was designed to replace the huge array of versions and models of the 109 that were all over the place in 1944, and it was just designed to bring all those under one roof and simplify production. The K4 had an MK108 as standard, nose-mounted. It was the only model, interestingly enough, of the 109 with a fully retractable tail wheel. You can see there's 2 small doors there, and the tail wheel disappeared completely inside the fuselage. Most K4s were fitted with the DB605DC, which could develop around 1900 horsepower. And the K4 with the DC and MW50 injection was the fastest 109 of the war, capable of 710 kilometers an hour in level flight at 7,500 meters. So that's a summary of all the 109 variants currently in War Thunder. I hope you enjoyed this video and expect more content soon. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Reach for the Sky, describing the 109. Thank you very much.